of methods, for analysis of networks. So with that, I just want to give you an overview of the work that we have been doing for last 5 years, roughly. And this comes and a group on mathematical biology, which functions here in the Institute of Mathematical Sciences in Chennai, in close cooperation with Professor Jorgen Jost, with whom most of you are familiar with. He was also my postdoctoral mentor at some point, and that's why I have a partner group with him, sort of develop geometry-inspired methods for complex networks. As you know, on the theoretical side, Jorgen Jost is a well-known person in differential geometry, and he has a lot of tools which he has developed. One of the things we do in a complement have promise for analysis in networks, and I apply it to various data sets and see if they are useful, because things in theory can be useful, but when you apply them, it may not turn out to be giving. A partner group is essentially to develop tools and show its successful application in real-world data science, in particular real-world networks. And in this activity, the other prominent members in coming days, and Jorgen and Emil have essentially developed a lot of discrete measures, which we are applying together to real-world data sets. In particular, today, I will talk about our app in terms of developing it for application to graphs, particularly two types of data sets. I will focus on brain functional connectivity networks from fMRI data and some data on networks in an ML. The main contributors for these applications that I'll show today are two students in my group. Pavitra Elumilai, she actually moved last month to a position in the international in Göttingen, and Yashart Yadav. So they were funded by this partner group. Harish Kannan also contributed to the financial data sets. He has since moved to a PhD position in mathematics in UCST, and she works now with PayPal. So in particular, in the financial data application, we were fortunate to have Professor Anirban Chakrabarti, who is now at BMN Munjal University, formerly at JNU, and Hirdesh. They are experts in the context of the neuroscience application. We got a lot of help from Nitin Williams as well, who is in Aalto University and is a computational neuroscientist. So with that acknowledgement, I'll try to, weave. So I should warn you that I'm not going to tell you the theoretical aspects, because there are better people at the conference, including my collaborators who will be giving talks. But what I want to tell you is that how this measured widely to various data sets and successfully applied to these data sets. So if you look at our daily life, complex systems and associated networks pervade. And network science aims to understand the art. If you look at the transportation system or society or the cell, you see networks everywhere. In the case of transportation system, you see the airline network, the road network, network of several, data now based essentially from online social networks. Facebook is a powerful social network. You also have professional networks like LinkedIn. And inside the cell, you have protein-protein interaction networks, metabolic networks. And the most important goals of network science is to understand the architecture and organization of these real-world networks. Moving on, you can see that real networks, many graphs or networks cannot be realized. Furthermore, if you look at the human brain, it can be approximated by a spherical geometry, and the associated networks are then in a non-Euclidean space. So it makes sense that since our physical or structure of these real-world complex networks using measures developed in non-Euclidean geometry. And in this direction, we have adapted concepts, specifically discrete Ricci curvature measures from Riemannian geometry for the study of complex networks. So I would just Ricci curvatures are give a different perspective on networks than what the standard measures which have been widely used so on till now in this area don't provide. Edge-based network measures. And I'll make a point about this. So as you know, the curvature in geometry essentially measures the deviation of a space from a Euclidean. In Riemannian geometry, in continuous spaces, there are three types of curvature. So the scalar curvature is associated to points, the Ricci curvature is associated to tangent vectors, and sectional curvature is associated to tangent planes. So when you do put these concepts to graphs, associate the scalar curvature to vertices, the Ricci curvature to edges, and sectional curvatures to triangles. And in particular, our work has been to develop discrete Ricci curvatures. Before, that has been applied heavily to different network data sets. What we have done is that we have also put it the other discretization due to Robin domain of networks and have applied it heavily to many real-world data sets. It is important to note that in the classical case, the Ricci curvature quantifies the deviation of a manifold from being Euclidean. And it is controls two properties, the average dispersion of geodesics along tangent directions and the growth of volume of distance balls or volume growth. When you and different discretizations of the Ricci curvature, in particular, the Olivier-Ricci curvature captures the volume growth property, while the Forman-Ricci curvature captures the dispersion of geodesics property. So A bit about the Forman's discretization of Ricci curvature. If I had to talk about it, it is my geometer collaborators who are experts on this. But briefly, this is the paper, original paper by Robin Forman. So the Forman's discretization objects, the so-called weighted CW cell complexes, which are of fundamental importance in topology and include both polygonal meshes and weighted graphs. In the setting of weighted CW cell complexes, Forman's differential geometry is so-called Bochner-Weisenberg formula that relates curvature to the classical Riemannian Laplace operator. So essentially, as I mentioned in the previous slide, Forman's discretization captures the geodesic dispersal property of classical Ricci curvature. So given the facts, one can easily, write the formula for the Forman-Ricci curvature in a graph, and that's what my colleagues did. And we tried to see if this could be useful is associated with an edge, as I mentioned. And the formula for an undirected network was constructed in this 2016 paper that we published, and it is given as follows: one-dimensional edges and zero-dimensional vertices. We obtain the following formula for the Forman-Ricci curvature of an edge. I mean, the formula looks very cumbersome, but it's actually much more simple. To be fair, it compute the Forman curvature of this edge E, which is shown in red. It only depends on the, this simplistic formula. It only depends on the edges which are incident on the two angles are incident on V2. So, and it also takes into account if you have assigned positive weights to both edges and the vertices. But for an unweighted undirected graph and the Forman curvature of an edge E for an unweighted graph and undirected graph actually turns out to be 4 minus the summation of the 2 degrees of the vertices anchoring it. Have applied this measure because unweighted real world graphs are many more out there than weighted real world graphs. We have typically in our initial publications applied, real power or real, property of this measure is that it is also applicable to weighted graphs and weighted graphs where you have assigned based on this formula to both edges and vertices. So what does this Forman curvature tell you? Okay, let's try to take this simple example. Two simple examples measure. So in an unweighted graph, as I mentioned, the Forman-Ricci curvature of an edge is given by 4 minus summation of the degrees of the 2 vertices anchoring it. So let's take the example. You have the edge in black for which we are computing the Forman curvature. So if you look at the anchoring vertices, there are 2 other edges which are at the 2 ends. So the Forman curvature becomes 4 minus 3 minus 3. That's minus 2. But if you look at this graph where there are 3 other edges which are anchoring each of the 2 vertices, the Forman curvature becomes 4 minus 4 minus 4 equal to minus 4. Much more spreading at the ends of this edge in this graph than this graph. The Forman-Ricci curvature essentially quantifies the extent to which the network spreads out at the ends of the edges in a complex network. So I just wanted to mention before I go into the applications, I'm just giving a summary of what we have achieved before I go to the applications that we have done over the last 2 years. Not just but the curvature is applicable to not just unweighted graphs, but also weighted networks, that is unweighted and undirected networks. Further, we have developed this measure in this paper also for a direct. Finally, in this paper, we have developed this not just for a graph, but also a 2-dimensional simplicial complex. And the formula simplicial complex, which is unweighted. That is, you have no weights assigned to vertices, edges, and faces. And the formula essentially simplifies to the following. That is, this is the relation between what we call as the augmented Forman curvature and the formula also for a weighted 2-dimensional simplicial complex, which can be applied. So in general, this already, the theoretical developments that we did shows that the measure applies, but weighted, undirected, weighted, directed, and further 2 simplicial complexes, which are weighted and unweighted. And you can imagine that it also applies to hypergraphs. Interesting is that when we started doing Forman-Ricci curvature, although Forman's discretization was proposed in 2003 and Olivier's discretization in 2007, work on Olivier-Ricci curvature application, we started applying it to real-world datasets only in 2016. So there was a much more work already when we started off in application of Olivier-Ricci curvature to real-world datasets. So one of the interesting things we found in this 2018 paper is that real-world networks, I don't know, I can't count here, there are about 14 real-world networks that we analyzed. And we wanted to see if there is any correlation between the Olivier-Ricci curvature and Forman-Ricci curvature. Most of you are geometers here, so you can see that since these discretize curvature, there is no reason why they should be correlated. But it turns out that what we found is that in practice, when you study this correlation in real-world graphs, the Olivier-Ricci curvature, and if you especially take the augmented version, where you account for these triangles as well, that is the triangular faces, the correlation is even higher. So this has maybe some as linear programming problem to be solved, and it may not scale up to very, very large networks if you are analyzing network with millions of nodes. So in such cases, Forman-Ricci curvature may act through Olivier-Ricci curvature. We are not particularly suggesting Forman-Ricci curvature as a surrogate for Olivier-Ricci curvature, but you can apply it to real-world data sets. So one thing we should note is that since Forman is what are neighboring edges and neighboring faces, it is very simple and fast to compute. So we have been able to, compute Forman-Ricci curvature in networks which are as large as 30. Olivier-Ricci curvature may be prohibitive for computation in those networks. So this property, this empirical observation, if I say so, this is not a property. High correlation between Olivier-Ricci curvature and Forman-Ricci curvature in real-world networks could have its own advantages. So, I mean, that was sort of a brief summary of what we have found. But I want to show that, there has been many, many more applications of Olivier-Ricci curvature to real-world networks. For example, if you see, it has been applied to neuroscience. It has been applied out already in 2016. Many of these studies were there, but Forman-Ricci curvature had not been applied to many data sets. But what has changed is that, of course, the group in which we work have examples I will focus on from now. I want to also point out that I think, even Kellen has applied, which I was so happy to see in this work. People have also but it can give many powerful insights as well, I believe. That is why you see now that other than us, people have started applying it to neuroscience. This is a paper about proteins, climate. The last few years, our work has led to Forman curvature also being widely used now across network science. With that, I'd like to present two particular applications of Forman-Ricci curvature and apply different discrete curvatures which are in our toolkit and see which could give very nice results. I also wanted to point out to the audience there that it is not always clear which will give the better answer, and see which one gives a better window to analyze a given data set. And so I would like to go on and present our work on application of these curvatures to brain functional connectivity networks. It's one of the large-scale studies that we did, and it took about 2 years. So to mention some of the highlights of the study, this is the first study which uses geometry-inspired network measures to study functional connectivity. In this study, we use the Abide-1 data set, and it is one of the large-scale studies because we are analyzing fMRI data from more than 1,100 human subjects. So this is a large, most of these subjects, starting from their fMRI data sets. And we are able to show that these curvature measures are able to differentiate between AST and typical would be you take networks for subjects with autism spectrum disorder and networks from control subjects, that is, those are cognitively normal, and you compare them and we see that, detect differences. I would also like to highlight in this course of this presentation that this is also the first study to use a non-invasive brain stimulation. Expand on this towards the end of the talk. And further, in this particular case, the Forman-Ricci curvatures identifies 5 novel regions which are associated with ASD, which are not picked by standard network measures or Olivier-Ricci curvature. So in this study, at least we find that Forman-Ricci functional connectivity networks. But as I would like to again highlight, in this analysis, we find Forman-Ricci curvature to be superior. In another data set, it could be that Olivier could be superior. Okay. And I should mention that we are not a neuroscience lab. I want to again put a disclaimer. The 2 students, Pavitra Illumilai and Yashat Yadav, were amazing because pipeline to construct networks starting from fMRI data. It's a very, very involved pipeline. It requires multiple skill sets, and actually my limited help from our neuroscience collaborator who actually works on EEG data. So this is amazing because it was students who actually drove this project. So the functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, captures blood oxygen levels, or what are known as gold signals. Thus, fMRI scans contain both spatial and time-varying information of the brain. So it's a 4-dimensional data. And the functional connectivity actually refers to different regions in the brain are activated synchronously even during rest, and they form the resting state functional connectivity of the brain. By the way, resting state functional connectivity network is established in neuroscience. Here, essentially, our goal was to see if Forman-Ricci curvature in particular could be useful in studying these brain functional connectivity networks. Resting state fMRI data have demonstrated that it is a convenient paradigm to identify neuronal correlates of neuropsychiatric disorders such as autism spectrum disorder. So in brief, what we did was that we from these Abide subjects, 539 subjects with AST and 573 control subjects who are typical or cognitively normal, if you can think about. So, and it went through a very detailed, details here. So And this spatial and temporal pre-processing of this data was done using a toolbox known as the Functional Connectivity Toolbox. It's an openly available toolbox. Briefly, the pre-processing involved both spatial pre-processing and temporal pre-processing. And in these pre-processing steps, what you're trying to address are few issues. Maybe there is head motion in the scanner. There could be inter-subject variability of brain size and shape. You need to then realign the scans and estimate subject head motion and identify the outliers. Then you may have to normalize institute MNI space. And finally, you want to extract the time series of every voxel in functional volumes. And during the temporal pre-processing or denoising, you are trying to deal with these motion artifacts such as the fake spike, and denoising is able to remove the residual motion effects and artifacts. So I don't have time here, but after doing this pre-processing and after that, some detailed quality assessment checks, we have number of subjects which passed the quality checks was 820, 395 in the AST group, and 425 in the TD group. The TD is the control group, which is cognitively normal. So finally, the fMRI scans contain bold time series corresponding to roughly 1 million voxels in the brain. So that would be a huge, I mean, you can make a voxel-wide network, but that's maybe not useful to analyze. So dimensionality reduction and easier neuroscientific interferences which are used. So you typically map them to certain atlases, which are much smaller in terms of regions. And we use the wides of interest or ROAs for, constructing the networks. So essentially our network will be 200 cross 200 of 200 nodes. So the brain is divided into 200 regions, and the number of nodes in our network will be for each subject, a pairwise Pearson correlation matrix, which is 200 cross 200 for these 200 regions. And this you can think of as the functional connectivity matrix. But this functional connectivity matrix is weighted and network. We use the standard, method that is used in analysis of such functional connectivity networks. That is, we use actually, I am not from the field, so I don't know why they usually do it. So typically what people do is that they keep a certain fraction of the edges. So the max based on the weights. So what we then do is that to be sure that our results are valid regardless of this edge density, we construct networks starting from 2% of edge density to 50% of edge density with an interval of 1 and 4%, so on. So we have 49 networks for each subject. Furthermore, to ensure that the graph is completely connected, we just don't take the sparsity-based thresholding that is based on this edge density, but also starting from the correlation matrix and then use the sparsity-based thresholding. And thereafter, we do a binarization. Since we had 820 subjects, and then we have edge density starting from 2% to 50% for each thresholds, and we have 820 subjects. So we have these networks to analyze. And so one of the things we want to see is that any property that we see at certain threshold, is it consistent or different edge densities, so that you are sure that this is not a fluke that you got at certain edge density. So one of the things I would like to highlight is that there's a lot of work and group are quite public. So all the codes and these networks that we have constructed. I should mention that you may think that why did we do all this? See, you can get fMRI data, and also you have not gone through typically through a universal or a uniform computational pipeline. So we wanted to process every image through a uniform computational pipeline and then analyze it. So that's why we redid everything from starting. They're available on the GitHub, and across all the codes that we use is available through my GitHub account. And colleagues in the audience are welcome to use them for any other purpose they want. I also wanted to mention that since we are not a neuroscience lab, and these kids did all this work by themselves, and this is a lot of computational work they did. So I just wanted to show that we have also guides you through every step, starting from downloading the image. Once you have the fMRI image from a repository, how do you go through in a pre-processing? So this is a video which my students linked. It actually gives you the demonstration of every step in the fMRI pre-processing going up to the network stage, from where you can analyze it. So, accessible to anyone, regardless of their skill set. So this is also available on it. So all the steps, if I say, are, my student have demonstrated, essentially redo everything. Or for some other, say you want to analyze Alzheimer's data, or you want to analyze any other neurodevelopmental disorder, and your fMRI images, you can essentially follow the hard work of learning ourselves. So we don't want others to suffer. So we have made it sort of accessible to everybody. So once we had these networks, then I come in, then I can understand what it is. All the statistical aspects of it, we have put the data set through rigorous statistical evaluation to ensure that any conclusions that we draw are regardless of X. So what we are able to show is that, so if you look at what we have shown here, is that we have from 2% to 50% the graph density. And if you look at for the in the control group, that is the cognitively normal group. And the red curve is for the Forman-Ricci curvature of the subjects with autism spectrum disorder. As you can see, from about 5% without any break, the Forman-Ricci curvature is clearly less for autism spectrum disorder subjects than for typically developing brains. While if you look at this Oliver-Ricci curvature, don't see, but it's what we have checked is that the difference is still there, but it is only statistically significant in these two regions. That is roughly from about 5% to 25%, and then subsequently from understand why that's the case, but that's what we get. You may ask, what about other standard network measures? So, I mean, why should we go and apply discrete-Ricci curvatures when you can do clustering coefficient or degree, or compared it against at least 5 to 6 other standard network measures? So what we find is that if you look at clustering coefficient also, the clustering coefficient is less for, autism spectrum. Range of thresholds where this difference is significant is again similar to what we find for Forman-Ricci curvature. Same is true for modularity, but if you look at betweenness centrality, the significance is for a less range. We have also ascertained that the kind of difference that we see in our work, because we have a large sample of fMRI data, connectivity networks, that is, if previously have others found that clustering coefficient is less for autism spectrum disorder subjects than typically developing brain, that turns out to be true. So our study is also so this was sort of at the global level. And then what we wanted to see is that, okay, there is a difference, but which are the regions which differ? That is a more local centric analysis. The Forman-Ricci curvature of the edge, and from there, the Forman-Ricci curvature of the node, which is like a scalar curvature. And we found which are the regions which are consistently differing in terms of Forman-Ricci curvature. So we took the Schaefer Atlas, which has 200 regions, and these are the regions in the brain regions. That is, out of the 200, there are 83 regions which, according to Forman-Ricci curvature, are differing between the autistic group and the control group. And the Schaefer Atlas 200 nodes are they're called, and these are listed here, and they have been color coded differently in these different views of the brain and those regions. And so we find that there are 26 significant motor network and 13 in the salient ventral attention network. These are the 3 RSNs, or the resting state networks, where you have majority of the nodes which differ, or the regions which differ. Oliver-Ricci curvature, the differences are only pronounced in only 14 regions. And of these 14, 4 are in the default network and 3 are in the somatomotor network. And the commonality between Forman and Oliver-Ricci curvature is only 8 brain regions. But if you look at cluster number of regions which differ between the two groups, is actually 78. So what I would have personally, I would say from a data science perspective, found disturbing would have been if our curvature measures would have predicted less compared. What we find is that clustering coefficient, if you use, you find 78 regions, and these 78 regions are divided into default as 24 significant regions, somatomotor 30 significant regions, and 38 are common with Forman-Ricci curvature. So one of the reasons we proceed further with only Forman-Ricci curvature is because Forman-Ricci curvature predicts equal and more actually than the clustering coefficient. So it is likely to have better predictive Ricci curvature if it gives less information than simpler measures which are used in graph theory. So again, I want to mention that all these analysis that we've done, the codes are available here, and you can reproduce and check all the data. So what we wanted to see if these regions have any meaning. That is, how do you know this is correct? Okay. I mean, these are human subjects. So one analysis we did, which is pretty new in this area, is what is known as this neurosynapse. It sort of captures different cognitive terms which have been associated with different brain regions. And you can actually input these regions and determine which are the terms or cognitive terms which are associated, which we did. I am just overlooking them. All the details are in the published paper or in the GitHub. All the codes are available. So you can go ahead and look at it if you're interested. So what we found is that in the default network, in respect to the Forman-Ricci curvature, you actually see terminologies associated with it, which are associated with social cognition, them associated with movement. And in terms of the salient ventral attention network, you find it associated with movement and language. So that makes sense because these are certain impairments which you associate with autism found, which differ, actually makes some sense. But how do we know that really this makes sense? So we actually were stuck for some time until it occurred to us that, and this is something very involved in biology, I'll try to summarize. So there is a lot of literature which is available out there, which actually which are like these non-invasive brain stimulation studies. They either involve the TMS. Essentially, for simplicity, if I was to make a cartoon thing, so these are certain regions in the brain which have been stimulated in the studies, and they have tried to see if if a person is autistic, if there is improvement in any of the cognitive, all published literature of this type for autism spectrum disorder, which was about 235 papers, and from there, carefully annotated regions which have been associated with improvement after non-invasive brain stimulation in autistic. Essentially boiled down to 31 regions out of the 200 in Schaeffer Atlas, which have independent experimental validation, if when stimulated, would lead to improvement in autism or people with autistic. 18 are predicted by Forman-Ricci curvature, and only 13 is predicted by clustering coefficient. So this is all a lot of analysis to show that you get more information out of applying the discretization regions in particular, which have been experimentally validated and associated with autism spectrum disorder, which are predicted by Forman-Ricci curvature, which is not predicted by the simpler standard measure clustering coefficient in this discretization curvatures than you would have got by applying standard graph-theoretic measures. So with that, I'll try to summarize this first part of the work. I will quickly tell you a bit about the financial work. I don't want to brain-wide and region-specific changes in functional connectivity network of individuals with ASD compared to typically developing individuals. Brain regions with altered Forman-Ricci curvature are associated to cognitive domains such as social cognition, memory, movement, and language. Brain regions with altered ASD-related symptoms upon stimulation. That is the independent validation using non-invasive brain stimulation studies. And Forman-Ricci curvature provides novel information about altered resting state functional connectivity in ASD, which is not. With that, I'll just quickly summarize some work we have also applied to financial markets. So again, the idea of this partner group is to show that this measure is applicable to networks or neuroscience. It is applicable to social science, and it seems that by application to various domains, networks, real-world networks in various domains, there seems to be a theme which is coming out that these are two studies that we have published, which actually apply to stock market data and global financial index data. I would just quickly summarize this work because I'm running short of time. It's so as you know, all the analysis of financial data. And one of the reasons we did this is because the group of Alan Tanabau had successfully shown that Olivier-Ricci curvature can be a good indicator of correlation-based networks constructed from stock market data. So we wanted to see if Forman-Ricci curvature could also be useful. Let me be very frank about that. Sort of find indicators from this data for economic crisis, which is like crashes and bubbles in the network. So what we did is that we were looking if these important events, for example, in the US stock, changes in the curvature measures when you apply it to analysis of time series connectivity networks constructed from stock market data. So what we did is that we collaborated because they have the data. We are not experts at all in this area. So they had the data for a 32-year period for two stock exchanges, the US S&P 500 and the Japan Nikkei 225. And because it survived over the 32-year period, so there was 194 stocks in the US market and 165 in the Japan market. And using the logarithmic returns, you can create a Pearson correlation, cross-correlation matrix like this. And then we construct networks you did in the case of the neuroscience data set. So what I can tell you is that quickly is that through the analysis of the networks that we constructed, so you can take sliding window, non-overlapping window, or overlapping windows. We have checked in detail in this works that our results are robust regardless of how you enter. Events in the stock market are indicated by changes in the curvature measures. In particular, curvatures can capture the system level features of the market. See, these are data in hindsight. We don't know if this can predict, but at least these are good indicators of changes in the stock market. So essentially, the curvatures can distinguish between both normal periods and all the major market crashes. The network is very modular. Okay, but when a crash happens, things are very correlated. When the crash happens, everything is going down in the stock market. So then you have a very highly connected stock. Critical periods, as I said, the network is highly connected, less modular, and more homogeneous. And this is true for both US S&P 500 and the Japan Nikkei 225 when we analyze it. And the results are not just Ricci curvature and also a couple of other Ricci curvatures, discrete Ricci curvatures we have applied to. But what I can tell you is that the correlation with standard market indicators like this, correlation of volatility with Forman curvature and correlation of volatility, the absolute values with Olivier-Ricci curvature. Again, we find that the Forman-Ricci curvature is actually slightly better indicator. We don't understand why of indicators. That's what this is. We have computed, but that's what our collaborators tell us, that this is a better predictor of standard financial indices which are used by economists. We have also applied it to a network of how the global financial indices are changing. We find very similar patterns that these curvature measures are quite useful. In particular, Forman-Ricci curvature is quite useful in predicting the different crashes and market events. About 47 minutes, if I'm not wrong. I'd like to just summarize and thank everybody for your attention. So this is sort of my range of collaborative work on. there are many people who worked on this have moved on. The people who are actually involved actually worked on some aspect of the curvature work that we have been doing for the last 5 to 6 years, and been also fortunate to get quite a bit of funding, generous research funding from other agencies. So I would like to acknowledge them. And with that, I'll stop and thank you for your attention, and be happy to take if there is any time.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. It's a very nice talk. So we have 3 minutes for questions. So any questions, comments? Okay, oh yeah, Colleen has a question. Colleen, go ahead.
Yes, thank you for the wonderful talk. I was wondering, you have do a lot of rich curvature. Is there any models for sectional curvature, and do you have a play with sectional curvature?
There is work in Jorgen's group, and I have been also collaborating on them. We have applied them, but the measures that we have applied, and Parvane would be giving some difficult to compute on larger graphs. But we have been playing with them for 2 to 3 years. I have been partially involved. Frankly, Kellen, as a PI, I can't to compute. So, I'm in the computational biology group, so I can't get mathematics students. So my students get degree in PhD. So we have people like Yashart and Pamit. Some of the limitations I have here.
Yeah.
But yeah, we have been playing.
Yeah, another very quick question. So you mentioned about a lot of applications of curvature, and you said that curvature has identified some new patterns that cannot be described like previous curvatures, and compared with other existing descriptors. Yeah.
So I think one of the most powerful things about the Ricci curvature seems to be a not yet largely explored discrete Ricci curvatures would be to find higher order correlations. Attuned to that. So, but I think one has to move and smartly apply. For example, there is a lot of talk in financial data that there are higher, could be a face, but not the edge. I don't think people have thought like that, but I think some smart attempts towards that, I think you understand what I mean. So could be a lot of opportunity to apply to the weighted graphs and weighted higher order networks as well. I think that would be a frontier to attack in times to come. Given that the data is more easily known.
I see. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Kellen.
Okay. Thank you. So
I have a small question.
Okay. Sure. Great. Go ahead.
Sorry. Areejit, I didn't catch all of your talk, but I caught the last part. So thank you. Ways in approximating your curvatures, and what kind of trade-offs do you have, and what approximation schemes?
I actually didn't get the question when you mean by approximating.
Yeah.
So there are
any measure
in the sense that
you want to come up with efficient ways to factorizing it. I mean, think about any kind of curvature in high dimensions on manifold.
Okay. So very good question. So I think I can briefly answer that in the sense that the augmented Forman-Ricci curvature, perhaps you missed my first part of the talk, only accounts for 2-dimensional faces. But in a data set, taking vertices, edges, and 2-dimensional faces seems to be good enough. So you may not need to go the 3rd dimension. Okay. So I think expert on those. So, but we see that that's quite good enough actually. So if you have higher order networks with just 2-dimensional faces, it seems to capture much of the higher order correlations. That's one of the things when you work in practice with empirical data.
Got it.
There's no theoretical proof for that. I mean, it's in practice only, I guess.
Thank you.
Okay.